Welcome to Know Your Flow, the podcast from FEM, where we help you understand your body, embrace your cycle, and feel empowered through every phase of womanhood. Let's get flowing.
Today, we're joined by Natalie Silverman from Fertility Matters at work. Natalie is passionate about helping workplaces understand and support employees navigating fertility challenges. In this episode, we explore how managers can approach sensitive conversations around fertility, including IVF, pregnancy loss, and infertility with empathy and confidence. Natalie shares practical guidance to help leaders support their teams without awkwardness or missteps, fostering trust, retention, and psychologically safe workplaces. Natalie, hello and welcome to Know Your Flow. Thank you for joining us.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
No problem. So Natalie, I'm going to dive straight in and ask you to tell us about your journey with Fertility Matters at work and what drew you to focus on fertility in the workplace personally.
Sure. Well, for me, it started over a decade ago. So my background's in broadcasting, and I went through fertility treatment whilst I was working on breakfast radio. And The nature of breakfast radio is that you've got to be there. So going through fertility treatment whilst doing that job was tricky, to say the least. And I had no idea what to say and how to have the conversation. So fast forward to having treatment and having successful treatment, I then decided to start a podcast, which I did and have done for the last decade, called the Fertility Podcast, and started to talk about issues. But it wasn't until I actually moved to another radio job that I said to that organisation, because they were talking about mental health, and I said, have you talked about fertility? And they actually, it was Bauer, they had Grazia, and they said to me, would you be interested in talking about it they've got that column, Womb with a View. Yeah. So I spoke about what it was like having IVF whilst at work and how I didn't want to tell my boss. And that ultimately then led me to actually be asked to talk about it in the workplace. And what happened was Becky and Claire, who are my two co-founders at Fertility Matters at Work, had also been talking about this topic, and various people that we all knew were like telling us all to talk with one another. And I'd met Becky already and then met Claire, and ultimately the three of us said, right, we're all talking about this, let's see what we can do together. Yeah. And just before we all got locked down in 2020, we met in a pub, we filled a table full of Post-it notes. They're both HR professionals, and we agreed that we wanted to do something to train people within the workplace, from HR, from managers, colleagues, to understand what others are going through, to really help, because all three of us had not been supported at work. So that is a very long story short.
It's so interesting talking to you about that, because so many of the women we meet with FEM are people who've been through a problem and then decided that they're going to address the problem. And it's just, I really think it's a woman thing that we say, well, we don't want other women to go through what I went through. And there's that kind of sense of like sisterhood, I guess, about it. But why do you feel supporting employees through fertility challenge is such an important issue for managers today to navigate?
I think, first and foremost, we hear so often people saying, I'm lucky I had a supportive manager. Mm-hmm. And we also know there was, I think, a survey from Forbes that people leave their managers before they leave the place of work. Yeah. So there's that relationship that's really significant. But I also think it's really important to say that this isn't just on managers' shoulders. This is a company-wide, like, cultural conversation that needs to happen. And because we know that so many people are going through this, it's 1 in 6, and we do a whole load of research all the time to prove this point, that it's a topic that needs to be talked about in the workplace. We know that almost 100% of people talk about it as a life event. So this is having a significant impact, and how you show up at work is affected when something in your personal life is happening. And trying to have a baby is something that we all pretty much are told how to have a baby and how to avoid getting pregnant. We're never told how it might be a struggle. And so then we find ourselves at work, and this is a thing that we assume is going to happen. And when it doesn't happen, it very quickly creeps into our everyday working life. And so what we were trying to do is help managers actually understand this, not fix it, because nobody can fix this for anybody. What we can do is support and signpost. So there's quite a fine line. It's not just on managers' shoulders, but because that relationship is so close, if we can have an understanding with managers, and we do a lot of work to train managers on how to talk about it, what to say, rather than being terrified of saying the wrong thing, hopefully that relationship can be improved, because loads of people take sick leave or annual leave, and you're not sick and this isn't a holiday. So we're trying to help the process.
I think it's really interesting, and I'm glad that you've sort of touched on the perspective that it's not about beating line managers up. It's about understanding what they need, the tools that they need to get this right, because this is a really difficult and sensitive and challenging conversation. And it can be difficult, especially if you're not someone who's been through it and you don't have that experience to kind of draw on to say, like, how should I behave in this scenario? What do you think it is that makes it's such a sensitive and challenging topic for workplaces to address?
I think, first of all, you're playing your cards to say, I'm thinking about having a family first and foremost. So assumptions are going to be made about your career progression. So it's really important that we understand that if somebody feels that they can say, this is what I'm going through, that person who's hearing that information doesn't automatically go, oh, they're going to be on maternity, because the reality is success rates of IVF are low. So when somebody's talking about this, don't jump over there and think, oh God, what am I going to do? So that's one thing that I just wanted to get across. The other thing is that there's no legal protection for you. If you're going through fertility treatment, there's no statutory right for paid time off. So unfortunately, we've had a lot of people reach out to us that have been either sidelined or they've been pushed out and pushed into NDAs and settlements because of discriminatory behaviour towards people, because they've entered into performance reviews, because there's a lack of understanding. They're not performing at work because there's a huge mental health toll on people's well-being. And we know that like over 60% of people were fearful about telling their employees, because you can't make anybody disclose, it's really personal. So what we try to do is, if you start talking about this topic in the workplace, inevitably, because it's 1 in 6 people that go through it, then people feel they can talk about it. But it's not enough to say nobody's talking about it, so it's not a problem, because it is. The reality is, it's like I say, 1 in 6.
So what you're saying is that if you start with the conversation as a business, you're more likely to get that feedback from people because they feel like this is safe and it's being accepted by the business, something that we are willing. Do you think this also links back to the fact that as a sort of society, we're very unwilling to talk about the first 12 weeks? We don't talk about the fact that we are in early pregnancy because everyone is so scared of having to say about miscarriage and having to deal with that. Do you think it's a bit of a lack of like wanting to be open in that vulnerable space as well?
Yeah, it's all related. And unfortunately, when you go through fertility treatment, you normally know you're pregnant sooner. So you're much more aware of being pregnant and then maybe losing that pregnancy sooner. And so that whole issue that we've got about not telling until 12 weeks, it's even more compounded, because if you can say what you're going through and you can say what you need, and from a manager's perspective, you know that you don't have to fix it, but if you can say to that person, tell me what you need, what can we do to work together, rather than the person not saying anything, they go off sick, the business productivity suffers, the person suffers, they might ultimately leave, because we know almost 40% of people talked about considering leaving. What the ideal is that it's more of an open conversation so that it's a win-win for everybody, but we can't guarantee that that's how it plays out.
Yeah. Do you think it's also a wider picture? So obviously one of the shareholders and directors at Una Health, which is the mother company of them, and I think that what I would say is it's that wider picture as well. So I think some people are really kind of tunnel vision about what is that person delivering now or not delivering now, and actually don't think about, well, actually if we create a supportive environment for that person at this moment in time when perhaps their productivity or their delivery for the business is quite not what we want, they will get back to that. And then there's those downstream costs of like, we don't have to find a different person, and there's all those other costs of the business in encouraging and empathizing with the person that we already have in our team. So is that something you think that needs to be a consideration for managers as well? It's about the bigger picture, not just where you are right now.
Totally. Like we know, like 86% of people that we spoke to, we did this big piece of research in June this year, said that they were attracted to organisations that openly talked about this type of support. And like you just alluded to, the cost of replacing
Yeah.
somebody is going to be much higher than spending a bit of time putting resources in place on your intranet about different kind of charities that offer support. It's things like if you've got EAP, if you've got access to, counselling support, saying to people, you can use this. We've already got it within the organisation. If you've got like mental health first aiders, these are people that you can talk to. The other thing to think about is when companies are talking about paternity or maternity leave, or they're talking about being family friendly and those types of conversations, say quite loudly to people who are trying to become parents, you're not here. We're talking to this group of people, and it's almost invalidating people's experience. So what you then do by talking about these things, talking about pregnancy loss, talking about challenges that people have, is saying, we see you, we want to validate your experience, and we want to hold on to you because we care about you. And it doesn't have to take much, to start this conversation.
No. If you feel like, because I said to you just before we started, we as a business haven't always navigated this very well, and I've been open about that. How do you go back and address that sort of after the fact? And how do you kind of, the person isn't with us anymore, so we did speak about it at the end, and we did say, we accept, that we didn't get this right, and we apologise and everything, but sort of how can you build on that experience as a business and go, well, actually, we're going to make this right, but we're going to acknowledge that we didn't, because it's, when you start bringing out all these policies and things, it's like, I don't want that person to be thinking, well, they didn't do that when I was here, and it's kind of like, how do we address that, as a business, and kind of move on and say, okay, well, we've learned from it?
Oh, I think it's exactly what you've said. It's admitting that we're only human and we're learning. And whenever we're working with organisations, because we have a framework that helps organisations become fertility friendly employers, what we always encourage is storytelling from lived experience from colleagues. So, say that person, I know you've said they're not there anymore, but say they were and they were happy to talk about it, they could say, look, it wasn't right for me, but this is what would have helped me. And you as an organisation are able to say, we've taken that on board and we're always building. And we've seen some of the best work in organisations where it's been driven by those with lived experience, being vulnerable and being brave and saying, this is helped me. You're only going to know your people if you ask them to tell you what they need. Nobody can get this kind of stuff. And like, you were saying to me, that awareness of actually what was going on wasn't necessarily there. And we can't force anybody to disclose what is a massively personal thing. And a lot of people going through fertility challenge have to deal with like emotions such as shame and failure and guilt, and they feel bad letting their partner down and their body working as it should, and they're letting their family down because there might be grandparents' expectations, and then at work they're letting colleagues down because they can't take it on, and they have to. We were just talking about the nature of treatment. You have last minute appointments, you might be getting phone calls that give you bad news. The emotional turmoil is a lot. And I think if we can understand that whilst people might be going through this for years, because it's not a given that it will work first time, the period of time is temporary in terms of the impact it might have on them turning up at work. So if we can say, look, with you, like, understand, and this is where policy and guidance comes into its own, because there's a reference point of what the organisation does for this, but it's also saying to the person going through it, okay, my company has got something for me to look at in terms of what I'm entitled to. So there's a starting point. And I appreciate that sometimes it can be policy for policy's sake, but that's why having like an awareness raising type conversation, a webinar talking about it, and we do lots to just explain what actually this issue is and what people go through and what it's like trying to navigate your work day whilst you've got all of this going on. We always hear managers and colleagues and even leaders, because we need role modeling. We need, if there's people in the organisation that might have lived experience, to even get involved and say, this was my experience too. People then who haven't been through it get a better understanding and can empathise, and that's all we ask is mindfulness. And even things like pregnancy announcements, baby shower collections, these things happen. Questions like, so do you have kids? We ask all the time. These are all things that, if you think about, are really hard for people that are really struggling, and you just didn't realise. You didn't mean it in any any bad way, but it's just a thing that we say. So it's helping all of us think a bit more about those of us that don't just look at our partner and fall pregnant. And we're also talking about men in this mix. We're not just saying this is a women's issue, and we're talking about the LGBTQ plus community as well, because this is a people topic. All people who want to have children might have challenges, is the reality.
How does it differ, would you say, or doesn't it, between men's experience of going through IVF to women's experience of going through IVF? Obviously, it's much more happening to the woman physically than it is to the man, but I'm imagining there's maybe different emotions for the man.
Yeah. I mean, my story is that our diagnosis was male factor, and my husband at the time was a personal trainer and a health coach and was in peak fitness and was mortified when he was literally told just before Christmas, the problems with you, and he fell apart, and it really impacted his mental health because nobody was talking about it, and men don't talk about that type of thing.
And they don't talk about anything.
They don't talk about anything, but they certainly don't talk about their virility. And so there's a lot of shame and there's a lot of guilt. And then in the process of fertility treatment, often the men are totally overlooked. If we're talking about a heterosexual couple, like my husband wasn't spoken to. They looked at me like my name was on the sample pot that he had to do a semen sample into, you know, and he felt like a spare part. And by having more conversations of men talking about their experience, it helps. Also, when we talk about loss, like we have lots of conversations with men in the workplace who say, we experienced a pregnancy loss and everybody asked how my partner was, and I was devastated, and nobody asked me how I was feeling, and I felt I couldn't even say because I hadn't been through anything physical, but I was grieving just as much. And I think understanding that this is a grief, whether it's the ability to conceive naturally, whether it's a loss of a wanted pregnancy, whether it's just having to understand that, you know, it's not going to be straightforward to become a parent, and maybe alternative routes like donor conception, you know, adoption, surrogacy, these are all alternative paths to parenthood. They all have implications on how people feel. So if we can create the conversation and encourage men to talk, and represent them. So you need men to talk about it. And that could be a blog post, even if it's not a live event, you know, getting people to talk is just a starting point. And even signposting, there's brilliant support now compared to what there was a decade ago. There's a great podcast called the Male Fertility Podcast. There's a podcast called Test Him. There's some really good resources that men can hear other men saying how rubbish they felt and how they just felt like all they could do was support, but then they couldn't fix, you know, so there's those complex emotions as well.
Yeah, and I think for men as well, as you know, they are very different to women, and they set a lot of store by what they can deliver and what they bring into the family as kind of a provider. And I think in a very different way, I've got that kind of experience at home as my husband's not very well and he can't work, and he has that I think there's a lot of that complicated feeling in that he can't deliver on the things that he is supposed to as a man
in society.
So I think it's interesting. But something you touched on there which is really interesting is you sort of spoke about grief. Just completely randomly, we've had an awful lot of bereavement for our employees over the last sort of 12 months, and I was sort of thinking there's a lot of alignment with the feelings that you get when you go through a bereavement. Then even if you are successful with IVF, then the process, because I think you're grieving the sort of I say normal with kind of hyphens, but the normal experience of getting pregnant and pregnancy. I think there's a lot of grief associated with the experience of IVF. Huge thank you to Natalie for such an open and thoughtful conversation. That brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. We hope this helps you to support people in your team who might be going through a fertility journey.